connecting online. I'm kind of going to be walking about, so if I'm not in screen, that's why. But during the Q&A, I'll definitely be here so that you can see my face. So I was mentioning, I'm just thank you. So I'm a product designer, but my journey was a little bit less than usual because I'm one of the few or the many that dropped out of university. I've never been a good student. I'm dyslexic, never been good at reading, so it was just never going to work out for me. And so I had to make my way in a less than typical path. And so what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about how I think about that now and what it means for us today as people in the tech space and the responsibility that comes along with that. So the first thing that I'd like you to do, before we dive into the story, is just take a deep breath. And I'd like you to imagine you see a doorway in your mind, and as you step through it, imagine it takes you back in time. And under your feet, you feel the desert sands of the great Egyptian empire. And it gets you reminiscent. And you think of this huge monolith of human ingenuity that you've erected and been a part of. But you decide to actually preserve this information, store this knowledge, and keep it for years to come so that those who come after you can learn from the things that you've learned. Or maybe instead you work every day and that knowledge dies with you and is lost to the future forever. Or maybe imagine instead you are one of the many librarians in the world's greatest library. 25 centuries have gone by after the Egyptian Empire, and there you are in the city of Alexandria, in the largest library known to mankind, with knowledge of all sorts available to share with humanity. And again, you see the value of these artifacts, of this knowledge, and you realize that this is something that must be protected and must be stored. And so you decide to send copies of all of these valuable pieces of art, poetry, paintings, and spread it across the world to ensure that it stands the test of time. Or maybe instead, you decide to preserve it and keep it because a book was worth a king's ransom. Until one day, the city of Alexandria is under attack, and this library is burned to the ground, and decades of knowledge, of discoveries, is lost to mankind forever. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does this actually matter? What does this mean for me as a person in the tech industry in the year 2022? We've got Google, we don't need to worry about books anymore. We've got all of these different algorithms that can calculate geometric aspects to sort of put together massive buildings, maybe if not pyramids. And I've given this talk a number of times now, and each time I dive straight into this question: why does it matter? But this time I'd like to do something a little bit different, because this time I'd like to take you along with me on the journey of how I actually came about this topic. So what if, instead, we ask a different question? What if we ask ourselves, just for this moment, we take everything, our worries, our concerns, the things at home that we still need to fix, what if we put that all to the side just for a moment? And we imagine a better world. What might that actually look like? And if we decided to not put the blame on anybody else and only look at the things that we have available to us, what would that world look like? And so I'd like to take you on the thought process that I took when I was imagining that better world, with the things that I have available to me. You see, when you put your mind to something and you dedicate your life to it, great things can happen. You see, if you were born in the year 1900, when you were 3 years old, humans would have achieved manned flight for the first time. And simply 60 years later, you would have also have experienced humanity reaching the moon for the first time. That's a single lifetime. Well, what happens if we put all of that knowledge, all of that ingenuity to the future from today? And so I asked myself this question, and I realized that for each of us to kind of have the impact that we would like to, when we think about the people who brought up the pyramids or the knowledge of the Library of Alexandria, that is someone who takes on a mission and a purpose to resolve as their life work. And so the one that I thought about was about learning and education, because that is the place where I never really managed, and it was a problem that I saw that I realized I could do something about. And maybe for a moment, if you think about it, if you spend some time, you might find something that you're willing to actually dedicate your entire life to. And so while I was doing this process, I realized I have to do three things. I have to look into the past to see how humanity has resolved this issue in different ways. And then I need to look at a little bit of the existing knowledge about learning and development. And lastly, I'd like to talk to you about a proposal about how we can actually make this process better. And so, from the title of my talk, you already know that my subject matter is mentorship. But what I wanted to do first is look at all the and existing developmental frameworks, structures, and systems that humans have used to pass knowledge on, and see what we can learn from that to see how we can actually bring to fruition that better future. And so we'll look at three systems. First is the parent-child relationship. We'll look at what it actually looks like, why it's specifically valuable, but also where it falls short, and why we need all of these other teaching mechanisms to actually grow and develop an individual. Then we'll look at the guilds and apprenticeships, and this was one of the main frameworks that existed, especially pre-industrial revolution. And then lastly, we'll look at the modern education system, which was built on top of some of the ideas that were quite prevalent during and after the industrial revolution. But before we do that, there's just something that I just want to point out about these types of relationships. You see, each one of them has got a specific structure for what the relationship looks like between the person that's learning and the person that is sort of passing the knowledge on. And so what I'd like to do is look at each one of these and see what we can learn from them, and then actually build a solution at the end of this that might actually be able to resolve the problems that we have in the modern day. But before we do that, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an idea of some of the underlying biological frameworks and some of the knowledge that we've uncovered about how we learn, so that we can more effectively assess each one of those three ideas. And so we'll start with this idea from Lev Vygotsky, and he introduced this idea quite a while ago. And one of the reasons why I think it's so interesting is what he aims to do is map out what learning looks like if we were to take, in a sense, everything that a person could possibly do into account. So the way he describes it essentially is this: you can think of the first parameter, which is the knowledge that you've mastered, things you already know how to do. If you were to maybe think about a baby, that might be really just crawling and crying and making a lot of noise, and that's all they can do to communicate with their parents. But then if you think about an individual, the master domain becomes much more complex. Maybe you're a Java developer, maybe you're a designer, maybe you're a product owner, and the things that you know, the things that enter into the master domain, so they expand. But regardless of whether you're a baby or a working professional, there is this other domain of things that we don't know yet, things that we haven't encountered yet, or the things that we have not yet mastered. And so this is essentially how Vygotsky mapped everything. And the idea he introduced was quite interesting, and it has a little bit to do with how our brain deals with risk. You see, as you know, I'm not a doctor, but I think what we can do is talk a little bit about some of the rough ideas that we use when we're actually dealing with a new situation, and which is the primary environment for learning. So essentially, you've got these three quadrants, the prefrontal cortex, which you can almost think about as the problem-solving engine of your brain. It's the thing that allows us to do complex calculations. It's the thing that allows us to do abstraction. It's basically the thing that separates us from most animals. And then we have the amygdala, which is the emotional center. It's the thing where fear comes from, like the fight or flight response, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It comes from that set of area. And the reason why we sort of need to know that is something very strange happens when we encounter a risky situation, because our prefrontal cortex, the calculating side, is in control when we're in a safe and calm environment, right? And then as soon as the predator comes out, our emotions will suddenly freeze. We sort of assess the situation, and if we see danger, we go into the flight response. And that is the difference. The calm thinking, the calculating, is when the prefrontal cortex is in control, when the problem-solving engine is active. But when we're in danger, and our heart rate goes up, and maybe our mouth gets a little bit dry, and maybe you start to forget your lines, your words that you're on stage, that's all the fight or flight response. And the reason why that's relevant is when you are in a dangerous situation, your ability to think, to learn, and to understand are compromised. Because that problem-solving engine is put in the rear seat, and our emotional center takes control. And what we learn from that, essentially, is that there's this interesting area around the master knowledge, because master knowledge can be governed by the prefrontal cortex, because we know what's happening there. Things are safe, things are understandable. But when you step out to the area where you don't know, typically the threat detection system is what takes over. But there's this interesting area that's just outside of your ability, where you're learning at best, where it's not so hard that you feel like a threat, but it's hard enough that you're growing and that you're learning. And that is when you're primarily engaged, and that is the idea of the zone of proximal development, right? It's the things that are just outside of your reach, but that you can learn. And then Vygotsky also introduces the idea. You see, sorry, before we get to the second idea, the thing that we realize is this area that's outside of our control, it's typically governed by the threat detection system. And so we can't necessarily think logically. But should the area of safety grow, the area of low risk expand, what we can learn increases. And so he speaks about an idea that when you have somebody in a sense guiding you or teaching you, your zone of proximal development grows because they provide that area of safety. They provide that environment that's safe for you to fail and to learn, right? Now, there's another idea by Yates and Dodson. They're two psychologists and researchers. And the idea that they introduced is this curve of performance, how basically pressure affects your performance over time. Essentially, low pressure is when you're bored, you're not necessarily interested, you're not learning anything new, and so you don't perform very well. But then things start to get a little bit harder, maybe that deadline for your assignment is a little bit closer, and suddenly you're actually putting in the work. And that's this middle section, where you're operating at your best because you're being challenged enough that your interest is being piqued, but it's not so much that you feel threatened. And so, by providing another figure, what Vygotsky calls the more knowledgeable individual, what they essentially do is allow you to expand your zone of proximal development through their assistance and through their help, right? And so, with these sort of ideas in our mind, we don't necessarily need to memorize them, but instead, what I'd like to do is reference them as we look at each of these three developmental relationships. So the first is parent-child relationship. And why this is such an effective learning mechanism is because the parent is typically there for most of the child's life. When they are learning their first steps, the parents are there to sort of urge them on and sort of create that environment that's safe to learn. And this is one of the reasons why it's the most common among species. I mean, parents exist in all kinds of different species, and it means different things at different levels. But there's a problem. Because what we're looking at is we look at the world through the eyes of the child. The problems that are in the ability of the child versus the problems that are outside of their ability. But what happens if we expand that and we look at the things that the parent is able to do versus the things that they're not able to do? And I guess a lot of us will have realized, if not all of us at this point, is you really realize you're maturing when you understand that parents don't know everything and they can't fix everything. And eventually you learn that there are things that you are going to have to face by yourself. And that's the challenge with the parent-child relationship. They can only provide that zone of proximal development in as far as they know. And so the first thing we can learn from this developmental relationship is learning happens better when you foster an area of safety, an area safe for learning. And that, whether it is a parent, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a mentor, whether it's a manager, we all have the ability to create that space that's primed for learning. And then we look at guild and apprenticeship. You see, the thing that was interesting about this is basically for the first time, learning wasn't determined by the family that it came from. You know, if you think back to some of the games that we played in the medieval times, or even back in history, the family unit essentially was also the craft that family did. And that's why some of the surveys like Smith, and I can't remember the others at this very moment, but it was the idea essentially that the people of the name Smith were blacksmiths, and your craft and what your family did were essentially tied together. But with the idea of building apprentices, essentially what would happen is that an individual would join the craft of somebody else and learn that skill outside of the bounds of the family. And so for the first time, you almost have these specialized teachers, people who have got a good understanding of a specific domain, whether it be engineering, the arts, or the sciences. And they can actually take up from where parents' limits lie, and they can actually provide that zone of proximal development, that ideal zone of learning in their specific niche. And essentially what we then get is a decentralized system of learning. But, like the parent-child relationship, it also has its own shortcomings. Because, like most other things, eventually, guilds became a political tool instead of a developmental one. And those that were meant to empower the next generation became the gatekeepers that were keeping them out. And then, at the same time, the Industrial Revolution swept the world. And what previously was done by specialized craftspeople started to be done with less skilled people and machines. And their ability essentially shot through the roof. And so a new need for learning was required. A need that could teach people at scale but simpler ideas. And that's really where guild and apprentices fell off, because not only was there a new need for learning, but also the need of what an actual guild and a specific craft person would do was also disappearing. And so if we pause there and we sort of think about this, what we can learn from the guild and apprenticeships is that we want to make the barrier to entry as low as possible for a specific domain of knowledge. So that the person, whether or not they have a specific certification, whether they come from a specific family or have a specific background, they still have a way in. And when you do that, essentially it allows you to tap into all of the skills that are maybe not on the surface, and all of the knowledge that isn't immediately accessible. And so if we look at the third and final developmental model, is our modern schooling system. And as I sort of mentioned, it was sort of this time where the need for a learning system was starting to change. And it had to be something a lot more scaled and a lot less individualized. And that's sort of what we have in the modern schooling system. It's this idea of a group of children sitting in rows and listening, and there's one person who knows everything that's sort of preaching everything at the front. Now, it's easy to think, because I didn't necessarily do very well in the schooling system, that I think it's got nothing positive. But there are a few things that it does, and it does them extremely well. The first of those is that its ability to disseminate standardized knowledge is actually breathtaking, because if we look at the world as it is now, we have never been more literate, we have never been more capable in terms of arithmetic, and some of these basic tools that we have for learning. Now, it's a little bit different once we get to the more complicated subjects. And that actually, in some sense, is where the schooling system starts to fall short. Because it's easy to think that children are a sort of cookie cutter type of situation, and not even children, I mean, even thinking about university and high school. But the truth that we all know as soon as we meet a kid is every kid is absolutely different. Their needs are different, their abilities are different, their interests are different. And there does not stand to reason that each of them needs a unique, tailored learning experience. And so if we sort of think about the modern schooling system, one of the things that it does very well and we can learn from it is that standardized, established knowledge should be spread as wide as possible. But this doesn't necessarily answer the phrase, but we'll get to that. And so essentially, these are the three things that we can pick up from these developmental models. It's first from the parent-child relationship, creating that environment of safety to allow people to fail, to make mistakes, and to learn from them. The third is decreasing the barriers to entry, whether that's through the graduate programs that we have or the people that we consider when we're hiring new people. The lower you bring that barrier to entry, the more diverse set of skills you have available to you. And lastly, making standardized knowledge available, whether that's through open source projects, whether that's through basic education that a person can access for themselves. For example, how I learned about my industry, like it was just a whole bunch of YouTube videos, online tutorials, and free content. And that free content is what allows the people who are on the outskirts, who don't necessarily get served by the system, to make a way for themselves. And if we look at society at the moment, we talk about three kinds of developmental relationships. The one-to-one or two-to-one, think about it, if both parents are in the picture. Then the one-to-few, which is what a guild would look like. A master craft person would have a number of apprenticeships, and that's the people that will be responsible for teaching. And then the one-to-many, where you have one teacher and a whole bunch of kids in a class. But if you look at society at the moment, one of those is missing. Because we replace guilds and apprentices with the schooling system. And the idea of technical, especially in South Africa, has sort of been pushed to the side. And this idea of specialized learning has been lost. There aren't necessarily communities or well-known places that you can go to get a tailored learning experience. And that is why I believe that mentorship is the foundation of this next phase of technology. Because more and more we're seeing that schools are not able to keep up with the syllabus. They're not able to keep up with the industry. And so instead, in my perspective, or at least what I do, is instead of trying to fix the school system, what if we try to create a new kind of relationship? A mentorship relationship that spans across companies, across schools, across communities, across backgrounds and identities. That can just be a person-to-person relationship. And so I'm going to ask you one more time to imagine. Imagine that you are sitting in the city square and you look over a sea of faces, completely hanging on your every word. Because surely you are the greatest thinker to have walked the face of the earth. And you have dedicated your entire life to the development of the youth of Africa. And one day, those that call themselves your enemy accuse you of the most heinous crime, corrupting the youth of Athens. Now, in this modern day, that might seem like a relatively harmless crime, but back then, that was a crime punishable by death. And so, as Socrates spends his last moments thinking on his life, he thinks back to the one apprentice that he did take. You see, Socrates and Plato had a very interesting relationship, a professional one. And in that time, Socrates did not write a word of his own thoughts. but Plato documented this, highlighted. And that is how Socratic dialogue is the underlying teaching relationship or mechanism that we use in modern schooling and in a lot of forms of dialogue. And that's something, that is an illustration of what mentorship can do when it is done right. And so I'd like to leave us with three things, three ideas that we can take away if we want to decide to be a mentor for somebody else. What would that actually look like? And this is where I would say this is where the practical side of things. I've talked a little bit about the theoretical understanding. But I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the things that you can do today to make you a better mentor. And now, for those of you who are managers and who actually have people that report to them, you might think that this is what I'm talking about. But I'm actually talking about every single person. Because if you're a graduate, there's a varsity kid out there who could use your mentorship. If you're a varsity kid, there's a high school kid that could use your mentorship. If you're a manager, you have your direct reports. If you're an individual contributor, there are other individual contributors out there who are trying to do what you're doing. And so the only thing that lies between you and your next mentorship relationship is you choosing to do it. So the first idea that we can sort of take away, the first practical element, is this idea of leading with questions. You know, when we think about a mentor, we think that there's this person out there who has got all the answers, and when we need help, we'll go to them, we'll ask them, help me with this thing, and they'll give you an answer. That's not actually what a good mentor does. A good mentor is more like you, who kind of gives cryptic answers to very straightforward questions and answers questions with questions. Because the funny thing about questions, and it's what Socratic dialogue is actually based on, is a question pulls more out of you as a person learning. It forces you to think for yourself. It forces you to actually step out of that domain of knowledge, the things that you have mastered, and to step into that unknown space of learning. And so what a mentor does, essentially, is they pull you into that space, but create the safety in the things that would be threatening to you. And so what we should do as those mentors is lead with questions. The second thing that we do comes from that graph that I showed you previously, the idea of understanding how performance is affected by pressure. You see, one of the things that, and the things that I even worried about when I first started mentoring people is what happens when your mentee comes to you and he asks you a question that you don't know the answer to. What then? And so there's this idea in the realm of psychology and specifically therapy that they do. And it's very interesting because you would think that a therapist's job is to pretty much fix the things about your life that fall outside of your professional environment. But actually what a psychologist does, especially with bigger problems, is they instead enable you to solve the problem yourself. Say for example, one of the problems that you have is you've got this extremely long paper that you need to hand in, and you are notorious for procrastinating, like myself, and this time you want to try and do it a little bit better. Now you would think that a psychologist maybe would help you put together a study plan, and they would help you go through all of that and the different steps and the deliverables that you need to do. But that isn't how they approach it. Instead, they break the problem. Instead, what they do is when you have a problem that's too big for you, they simply talk to you about it. And they get you to break that problem into individual pieces. Until a piece is small enough that you're willing to start there yourself. And so it's this thing of ensuring that the problem is only solved when the person with the problem chooses to solve it. Because it comes from the idea of give a man a fish, feed him for a day, teach a man a fish, feed a man a fish, feed him for a life. And the reason for that is, by sort of going through this process of helping them break the problem down for themselves, you give them not only the tools to solve the problem today, but also the tools to solve a bigger problem in the future. Because with that same approach, you can break any problem down into its individual pieces and resolve it. And that's what they do in here. And the last thing that's really important and one that I really like to focus on is this idea of allowing a person to fail. The last time I gave this talk, one of the people asked, what do I do if my mentee doesn't want to learn? Like they almost want me to spoon feed them, they want me to do everything for them. How do I deal with that? And in the moment, I sort of answered like, allow them to fail. But I hadn't really thought about why I said that. It was sort of like a thing that kind of just came up. And when I spent some time thinking about it, I realized that typically when a person is asking you to do something for them, it's not always because they can't do it. It might be that they're scared to do it and fail. And so what we can do as a mentor, sometimes, is allow that person to step a little bit outside of their domain of ability and capability and knowledge. And sometimes when they do that, they are going to fail. But the thing that actually matters, and the thing that makes a mentor valuable, is how you help them move forward from the failure. What does it actually mean when you fail? Because if you are in danger when you fail, like if you're going to get fired for making a single mistake, nobody's ever going to step outside of their kind of knowledge. But if they do fail, they don't meet that deliverable, they don't meet that deadline, and they see that it's okay sometimes to not do that. And it's okay to crawl a little bit before you run. Then people become more comfortable stepping outside of that domain of master knowledge and stepping into the unknown and facing new challenges. And those, to me, are three of the things that we can take away to at least start this journey. And maybe, at some point, by taking these three things into account and becoming the mentors for those people who need us out there, maybe what we can do is stop imagining a better world. Stop wishing for problems to be solved. And instead, maybe we can choose our own path. We can choose something that speaks to us. A problem out there that calls to us. And maybe we could be the ones to do something about it. Thank you.